Let's have a look at what cards counter Tenyi, because Tenyi is probably the best deck in the format right now. Let's have a look at the threats that are present in the deck first. First is Vishuddha, which can banish itself from the graveyard to bounce back a card that your opponent has. Mapura, that can banish itself from the graveyard to negate a effect that targets your monster. The Water Tenyi, that can revive a non-effect monster and pop a card without targeting, and the field spell that prevents your opponent from affecting your non-effect monsters. And for the extra deck, we have Baxia, that can spin back 2 cards that your opponent has back to the deck, and Draco Berserker, that is really strong, that has a bunch of attack, and also can banish a monster that activated its effect. Okay, so I have compiled a short list of cards that I think is really good at countering the deck. Some of them are expensive, some of them are pretty cheap, some of them are better than others, but let's have a look at them. First is the obvious choices. We have IDP, which is probably the best limit free trap that counters the strategy. It is quite expensive to get, so I don't really recommend you trying to get free copies of this card. If you don't have it, you might be better off trying to get the other options in this list that are much easier to obtain. Next is Lancia and DD Crow. These are also pretty expensive hand traps, but Lancia is especially really good against Tenyis because it stops them for the entire turn. DD Crow is less good because it only stops one graveyard effect, but it also works better against some other decks as well. And Skullmeister is kind of the free-to-play option of DD Crow. It basically does what DD Crow does, but it is a lot cheaper to obtain, and it negates the effect. So it's better against stuff like Orcust, which have a lot of graveyard effects that are hard once per turn. So if you negate the effect, they can't use the same effect again during the same turn, because for DD Crow, you kind of need to preemptively use it before they use the effect, which actually means that they haven't used the effect yet, so they could just mill another one and use the effect again. But for Skullmeister, it negates the effect, so it prevents them from using any hard once per turn graveyard effects anywhere during the same turn. Chaos Hunter is also pretty good as a free-to-play option. It's kind of like a free-to-play Lancia. It does require you to discard one card to summon itself from the hand, but it also prevents your opponent from banishing any cards as soon as it hits the field, and as long as this card is on your side of the field. So if your opponent can't get rid of this card, this effect will remain for the remaining of the game, and it will be a really difficult time for your opponent to actually get rid of. And so for some less effective options, we have Amano Iwato. This card is really good if you have a way to make it remain on your field, something like Smile World as the skill. You can, as long as this card is on the field, your opponent basically cannot play if they're playing Tenyi, because the entire deck is basically revolving around monsters only. So if you have Amano Iwato on your field, you basically win the game. And for Kaijus is also a pretty good option against Tenyi specifically. Not only does it remove the monsters without them using the effects of the fire or water Tenyi, and also bypassing the field spell, it also gives them an effect monster, so they can't just summon the other Tenyis from their hand, because that requires you to have no effect monsters. So they will need to find a way to actually get rid of this card, which is actually not as easy as you may think. For the spells cards, we have Necro Valley. This card is really good against a lot of meta decks that we have right now, because it stops you from basically accessing your graveyard. And other decks like Constellas and Mayakashis, they also love to grab back cards from the graveyard or banish stuff from the graveyard, which this card also prevents. This card does affect both players, so not every single deck can use this card, but if you can, it is really good as an option to counter the current meta. And as for free-to-play options, we have a Silent Graveyard. This card is actually arguably better than Necro Valley, because it only affects your opponent if you use it in your opponent's turn. You can just use your own graveyard whenever you want during your turn, and then you can set this card, and then during your opponent's turn, you can flip this card face up and then start negating your opponent's stuff. And also, it negates any effect that is activated from the graveyard this turn, as a quick play spell. So what you can do is you can wait for your opponent to banish their stuff from the graveyard, wait till they use something like an Ashuna effect or a Vishuda effect, and you can chain Silent Graveyard, and that actually negates the effect of the effect that is before discard, because the chain resolve order discard resolves first, and then since the effect of a Vishuda resolves while this effect is active, it will negate that effect as well. And also this does negate cards that banish themselves from graveyard, even though they are technically not in the graveyard anymore, because when they are activated, they were in the graveyard, so that also negates. But this doesn't require a discard, so it's not so nice for certain decks that don't really want to discard cards. But I think this card is just really good in general against not only Tenyi, but other stuff like Mayakashi as well, to chain this card in response to the quick effect of the Link Free. That also prevents the effect from resolving as well. Other more spicy tags we have is a Summoning Curse. This card is pretty funny. It requires your opponent to banish a card from their hand every time they special summon. So imagine a scenario where you go first and you activate this card before you end your turn. So you do your combo and then you activate this card as the last thing you do. And then during your end phase, you have to pay 500 life points, but that really doesn't really matter that much. And your opponent starts a turn. They special summon one of the Tenyis that requires them to banish one card, and they make their Link 1, and that banishes another card. So even if they have Vishuda in hand, they still need to banish a minimum of 2 cards from their hand before they can get rid of this card. And even if they do get rid of this card, they still already spent a Vishuda effect to get rid of this card, so they can't use the Vishuda effect to get rid of your other cards that you have on your field. So this card is really good. It doesn't directly stop your opponent from playing, but it does really lower the amount of resources that you will have access to. And another similar card is Summon Breaker. This card is a pretty funny field spell, and again, you will use this card before you end your turn, after you do all your combos. And it says during main phase 1, if a turn player successfully conducts the third summon, it becomes the end phase. So this is really difficult for Tenyis to make unless they open with Vishuda or they open with Cycle. Because even if they open with something like Ashuna or the quick play that tributes their own monster, they will need 3 summons to have access to Vishuda. And by then, you will be able to activate this effect to end the turn immediately. So imagine if they open with something like Ashuna, and then they special summon Ashuna, that's their first summon, and they make their Link 1, that's a second summon, and then they banish Ashuna from the graveyard to grab Vishuda from deck, and that's a third summon. So even before they have the opportunity to link off the Vishuda, you end the turn immediately, and that is obviously really good. But the problem with Summon Breaker and Summoning Curse is that they also affect you as well. So you will need to have a way to get rid of this card when your turn comes back, because otherwise you will be affected by the continuous effects as well. So it is best if you have some kind of effect to get rid of this card during your own turn, so you don't get affected by its effects as well. And also, these 2 cards are only ever good going first, and cards like Necro Valley and Silent Graveyard are also pretty good going second, because you still get to prevent your opponent from doing their follow-up combos by sealing their graveyard. And for the case of Summon Curse and Summon Breaker, they can easily just use the effect of Vishuda from their graveyard if they go first, and already have their graveyard set up, so you can just pretty easily get rid of these cards. And for a free-to-play trap option, we also have a Different Dimension Ground. This card is, again, a good card going first, but not so much going second, because this card basically makes all of the monsters go to the banished zone instead of the graveyard during the turn you activate this card. So if you have this card set as your turn 1 setup, and then you activate this card immediately during your opponent's turn, any Tenyis that they link off will be banished immediately, and they won't be able to activate their graveyard effect. So it's basically like Silent Graveyard, except you don't need to discard a card, and also it's bad going second. But I guess it's also an option that you can consider as an option to actually counter Tenyis as well. For the extra deck, we obviously have Abyss Dweller. This card can be easily made by a lot of meta decks like Constellars, or even stuff like Salamangreat can make this card without too much of an issue. This card is both good going first and second, and counters other decks like Mayakashi's as well. Okay, so let's have a look at decks that actually have a good matchup against Tenyis. Obviously, Tenyis have a good matchup against Tenyis because the deck can play through pretty much anything. So if you are playing a Tenyi mirror match, the player who goes second has a massive advantage over the one going first because the effect of Vishuda and Baxia can basically play through the target negates of the Fire Tenyi that your opponent has, and also gets around the effect of the Water Tenyi that triggers when you destroy the monster. One bigger problem is if they have the field spell, but even if they do, you can still get rid of it using Vishuda or any of your generic staples that you play alongside the main Tenyi combo. Next is Speedroid actually has a really good Tenyi matchup if you go first, because having Crystal Wing and Clear Wing both on your field basically stops whatever your opponent is trying to do. Especially Clear Wing has a really good application against Tenyis because the Vishuda has a level of 7 and also it targets your monsters. Baxia is a level 5 or higher monster that targets, so you can use the effect of Clear Wing to negate the target effect of the Vishuda, and then you can use the first negate of the Clear Wing to negate the Baxia because it is a level 5 or higher monster. And then you can use Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon to negate anything else that might pose a threat to your end board. Constellars is a pretty good counter to Tenyis, as well as any deck that can consistently make a Best Dweller going first. Constellars specifically also have access to Pleiades, and even though they can banish your Pleiades with something like a Draco Berserker when you activate your effect, it still doesn't negate the effect, so you can still bounce back any synchros that they have, which is pretty nice. And S-Force is also pretty good because of this card. Gravitino banishes any monster that is sent to the graveyard that is in the same column as your S-Force monster. So it's basically like different Dimension Ground, but it's a built-in mechanism that you can very consistently access within your deck. And let's talk about some other non-meta or less popular decks that also counter the strategy. The main one I want to talk about is Gandora. This deck is actually quite underrated, I think. This deck can play through a lot of disruptions, even though it really has a less good matchup against really heavy back row decks like Leviathan or Constellars, because even though they can play through some interruption, they can't play through like 4 of them. So this deck tends to have a slightly less good matchup against back row heavy decks, but against Tenyis that don't put up any back row at all, this deck is really, really good because they don't care about what protection they have from the graveyard, because a card like Gandora just banishes everything from the field and their graveyard, gets up to like 8k attack, and then just attacks full game. So even if they have life boosting skill, this deck can still OTK through them pretty easily. Next is Cosmo. Cosmo actually is pretty hard for Tenyis to get rid of because all of their big ships cannot be targeted, and Vishuda and Baxia both target, so they really have to find a way to get around the target protection or just run over it by battle, using their 3k monster to crash into Dark Destroyer, or use the green Tenyi, which is not really accessible through their main combo because they usually won't go through the green Tenyi before they go through the other better Tenyis. And even if they do, the destroyers and the other ships still float into smaller ships, and the pilots also can tag themselves out if they are being targeted to summon the big ships. So it's basically a really annoying deck for Tenyis to play around. But the main issue is, of course, this deck is not very consistent because you need a pilot plus a ship to actually start your combo. So yeah, and the same also goes for Shadows. So if Shadows go first and open with a playable hand, they can very easily just make Winder and basically win the game on its own, because as soon as they activate the effect of the Tenyis to special summon themselves from the hand, you can activate something like a Schism or L Shadow Fusion to immediately make Winder and lock them out of their special summons. So with the special summon prevented, they can't even make their Link 1 to link away the Vishudas or Ashunas they have in there on the field to actually use their graveyard effect. So even if the deck doesn't actually prevent them from using Vishuda's graveyard effect, it does prevent them from having it in the graveyard in the first place, or just preventing them from playing the deck in general. So yeah, that's basically it for this video. It's kind of the first time I've done something like this before, so I'd appreciate if you tell me if you like the format, if there are something else that you want me to talk about, if the video is too long, too short, or if I missed something. I'd appreciate it if you tell me in the comments. But for now, thanks for watching and goodbye.